I was dangling 15 feet above my own driveway, spinning slowly in a harness, while the HOA president screamed into her phone about airspace violations. Below me, a Channel 5 news van pulled up, its cameraman nearly tripping over a garden gnome to get the shot. 2 weeks earlier, I just wanted to park my car without a neighborhood turf war. Now, I was midair, prepping for a legal helicopter landing on my own property, while Karen yelled something about aviation terrorism. If you're wondering how a calm, middle-aged guy with a love for classic muscle cars and a low tolerance for nonsense ended up here, it all started with a driveway, a smug HOA, and one very entitled parking habit that flipped my peaceful life upside down. It began, as most suburban disasters do, with passive aggression. I moved into the neighborhood after retiring early from a career in municipal systems design. I'd spent 2 decades streamlining city infrastructure software, so I thought I was ready for anything. What I wasn't ready for was the HOA. The first few months were peaceful, until I noticed a shiny black SUV parked just a little too far onto my property. It wasn't a one-off. A few days later, it was back. Then another car. Then a parade of minivans during Sunday brunch hours. I chalked it up to confusion. My driveway sits slightly off-angle from the street and has no curb to define its edge. I marked it with reflective cones. Simple, visible, polite. 3 days later, I received a letter. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't even signed. Just an anonymous HOA notice in perfect legalese font. Please refrain from unauthorized lawn fixtures that disrupt community aesthetic standards. I removed the cones, already feeling the slow rise of irritation that only bureaucracy can trigger. The very next morning, a silver Lexus was parked completely across the mouth of my driveway. My classic Camaro, yes, the one I'd been rebuilding since college, was trapped in the garage. I knocked on a few doors and found the culprit. A board member's niece was hosting brunch. She smiled like I was the rude one. "It's just for a couple hours. You don't need your car, do you?" That was my first real meeting with the HOA president, Karen Montgomery. Tan trench coat, bleached bob, clipboard of doom. She stepped outside like I'd disturbed the Queen's tea. "Sir, our community has shared values, including flexibility with space. This isn't a strip mall." I calmly pointed out that it was my driveway. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" I was. I had the deed. I had surveyor reports. I had digital renderings if she needed them. I offered to show her. She declined with a wave. "Take it up with the board." And so began what I now refer to as the space war. Over the next 2 weeks, cars would block my driveway at random intervals. I received 3 more letters from the HOA, each more absurd than the last. One accused me of unauthorized curb painting, even though I'd used chalk. Another warned me that confrontational signage could result in fines, because I'd printed a laminated note that said, "Private driveway, please do not block." But the real kicker came when I finally got the Camaro tuned up and gleaming. It was parked outside for less than 12 hours when I stepped out to find it gone. Towed. Vanished. The city didn't have it. Turns out, the HOA had used a private towing company under the claim that it was an abandoned vehicle. The invoice was taped to my front door like a ransom note. $300. Plus storage fees. When I called Karen, she told me, "Classic cars attract the wrong kind of attention. We're trying to maintain a safe image." I don't know what she thought I was going to do. Yell? Beg? Threaten legal action? What I actually did was much quieter. I sat down with a glass of bourbon and opened my laptop. You see, I helped design this city's digital zoning infrastructure 10 years ago. I knew the code like the back of my hand. And that's when I saw it. A loophole so wild, so hilariously specific, I thought it was a glitch. My lot, due to an outdated zoning artifact, was still technically listed under a vertical transit-compatible classification. In plain English, I was legally allowed to construct a personal helipad. And that's when the idea hit me, not just to build one, but to use it. Of course, I didn't start with concrete and fanfare. I made a plan. I checked current FAA guidelines. I made sure no flight paths would be disrupted. I filed for every permit, attended 3 boring city planning meetings, and even had a civil engineer inspect my property. The best part? Not a single action required HOA approval. The law predates their charter. Karen had no idea. She was too busy trying to write me up for aggressive posture during HOA meetings. Meanwhile, I was quietly pouring a circular slab right where the HOA had towed my car. I even had a bit of fun. Told curious neighbors it was an art installation about lost freedom. One guy asked if it was a crop circle. I shrugged and said, maybe it'll summon something fun. By the time Karen noticed, it was an actual helipad, complete with boundary lights and a digital wind indicator. It was too late. The city had signed off. My permit was laminated and legal. I even made sure the final concrete pour was scheduled during the next HOA brunch party. Nothing like a cement truck in your cul-de-sac to ruin a mimosa. She stormed across the street, practically frothing. You can't just build an airport in the middle of a neighborhood. I smiled. Not an airport. Just a personal helipad. Totally legal. Want to see the permits? She sputtered something about safety, about children, about low-flying chaos. I showed her the FAA compliance letter. She threatened to call the city. I told her they'd approved it. She demanded I remove it. I offered her a seat on the first flight. That's when she turned red and marched off without another word. The next day, I got a visit from a man in a blazer who introduced himself as a reporter covering absurd zoning stories. Apparently, word was getting around. Is it true? He asked, barely able to hide his grin. You're putting in a helipad because the HOA blocked your driveway? I nodded. That's the gist of it. And when he asked if he could film the first landing, I couldn't help myself. Oh, I said, you're absolutely invited. Bring popcorn. When I tell you the process of legally installing a helipad was easier than getting a no parking sign approved by my HOA, I'm not joking. The city was surprisingly unbothered, almost amused, that someone actually wanted to activate the ancient zoning code buried under decades of suburban development. The clerk at the permit office actually said, "You're serious? Nobody's pulled this one in 20 years." I told her I wasn't just serious. I was ready to fly. She chuckled, pulled out the dusty form from a side drawer, and added, "Well, this'll spice up the week." See, the thing about outdated zoning laws is that they're often left behind like digital fossils. My property was originally part of a proposed air transit corridor from back in the 1960s, when people were convinced we'd all have personal helicopters by now. That plan died a fast death, but the zoning stayed. The HOA never realized that while they were citing shrub trimming codes from 1998, my lot was sitting on aviation gold. As long as I followed FAA guidelines, kept a clear perimeter, and respected noise ordinances, I was legally allowed to operate a personal helipad. No HOA override. No community vote. No Karen veto. I hired a zoning consultant, mostly for fun, just to make sure I didn't overlook anything. He was this younger guy named Drew who looked like a professional skateboarder but talked like a law professor. He flipped through the blueprints and said, "Honestly? This is genius-level pettiness. I live for this." We became fast friends. He helped fast-track the soil reports, double-checked my environmental impact statement, and even flagged a wind drift issue that would have made landing trickier. I didn't just want this helipad to exist. I wanted it to be flawless. Of course, I had to bring in professionals. The concrete pour needed to meet a specific FAA grade, which meant no shortcuts. I found a crew that usually did helipads for hospitals and private islands. When I explained it was for my driveway, there was a long pause on the phone. Then the contractor said, "I have so many questions. But let's do it." Within a week, the back half of my property looked like a mini construction zone. Karen was pacing her lawn like a hawk watching a field mouse. She kept coming out in a visor and notepad, pretending to inspect her flowers, but it was painfully obvious she was trying to gather intel. At one point she asked one of the workers what we were building, and the guy just said, "A really intense patio." She walked off without another word. To make it all official, I filed a public awareness statement for neighborhood transparency, which the city clerk said wasn't required but would look good on paper. I printed a single-page flyer that said, "As part of a legally authorized zoning designation, vertical transit operations may occasionally occur on this property. All activity is fully compliant with FAA regulations and Municipal Code 74.2b. I posted one copy on my mailbox and another on the HOA's community board. Karen lost it. Within hours, she called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't invited, obviously, but one of my neighbors texted me a full play-by-play. Karen apparently opened with, "He's bringing aircraft into a family zone." Someone else asked, "Is that illegal?" Karen responded with, "It should be," which is not quite the same thing. When someone else pointed out that they were all fine with HOA members' guests constantly parking on my private property, she snapped, "That's different. Those are cars." The next morning, I received a cease and desist letter on HOA letterhead. It was filled with dramatic phrasing like "endangering community tranquility" and "aerial recklessness." I handed it straight to my lawyer, who specializes in property disputes and municipal loopholes. He laughed for a full minute and then said, "This is the HOA equivalent of writing in crayon." He fired off a reply so blistering and so dense with legal references that they'd need a law degree just to understand the first paragraph. Now came the fun part, selecting a helicopter. I didn't need a huge chopper, just something small, safe, and preferably electric. I visited a local aviation center that specialized in recreational aircraft. The salesman took one look at my application and said, "Oh, you're that guy. The driveway guy." Apparently, the story had started to circulate in aviation forums. I was becoming suburban legend. He walked me through several models before we settled on a sleek, ultra-quiet two-seater that looked like something out of a futuristic cop drama. Battery-powered, low-vibration, and best of all, FAA-compliant for low-altitude residential landings. I arranged for a lease and scheduled my pilot certification sessions immediately. I wasn't just going to land a helicopter, I was going to do it legally, safely, and with flair. Karen, meanwhile, was not taking the quiet path of acceptance. She began patrolling the neighborhood with a measuring tape, checking every lawn for violations. One neighbor got a warning about their trash cans being too visible. Another was cited for excessive wind chimes. It was clear she was spiraling. Then came the night sabotage attempt. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a blinking alert from my security cameras. Someone had entered the construction zone. I pulled up the feed and watched as two shadowy figures crept across my lawn, one of them wielding a paint roller. They'd started defacing the helipad markings when the floodlights snapped on. The camera caught their faces perfectly, Karen's dog walker and the HOA vice president. They ran like raccoons caught in a dumpster, tripping over the boundary lights as they went. I didn't call the police. I didn't yell. I simply forwarded the footage to the FAA inspector assigned to my case and the city zoning office. Both responded within hours. The FAA issued a formal warning to the HOA for interfering with regulated aviation equipment. The city sent a compliance officer to the HOA president's house. She wasn't home, but I heard through the grapevine that the HOA board had an emergency session the next night. I'm guessing it wasn't a cheerful one. Just as I thought things were calming down, 2 FAA officials showed up unannounced at my door. My heart sank for a second, wondering if Karen had somehow found a way to sabotage the permit. But the lead inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, smiled and said, "We just wanted to see this setup for ourselves. It's not every day we get calls about suburban helipads." They toured the site, checked every measurement, ran a safety test, and left with nothing but praise. Maria even said, "You know, this might set a precedent. You've got a tighter setup than most hospitals." I offered them coffee before they left. One of them asked, half joking, "Mind if we watch your first takeoff?" I told them to bring popcorn and a camera crew. With the helipad done, the permits approved, and the helicopter scheduled for delivery, I just had one final touch. The guest list. And at the top of it was a very interested local reporter who had already started teasing the story with the headline, "Local HOA War Ends in Helicopter Showdown." I could only imagine Karen's face when the news van rolled up. I'd gone from being unable to park my car to planning a full-blown legal liftoff, all within the very system she tried to use against me. And the best part? I was just getting started. By the time the helipad was complete and the helicopter lease finalized, the tension in the neighborhood had reached an almost cartoonish level. People were walking their dogs just a little slower past my house, sneaking glances at the glowing perimeter lights like they were expecting a UFO to descend. Every delivery driver paused longer than necessary at my mailbox, probably trying to figure out if this was some kind of art installation or a billionaire's fever dream. And right in the middle of it all, Karen was unraveling in real time, determined to reclaim her self-declared throne as queen of the cul-de-sac. The cease and desist letter she sent clearly hadn't worked. Neither had the sabotage. Her latest tactic was a city-wide smear campaign. I found out from Drew, my zoning consultant, that she'd started calling various local offices and expressing concern that I was militarizing suburban airspace. She claimed to one department that I had plans to lease my helipad to mysterious outsiders, and to another that I was part of some cryptocurrency drone cartel. Each call was more absurd than the last, and luckily, most of the city workers already knew me or my history with their zoning systems. One even emailed me directly with, "Please tell your HOA lady to stop watching spy thrillers." But then came the real twist. Karen went to the media. Specifically, she contacted a rival news station, Channel 9, the same one that once ran a 12-minute expose on a guy who built a backyard waterslide in violation of pond runoff rules. She fed them a story about an unregulated aircraft landing strip threatening community safety and mental well-being. That was her actual phrase, mental well-being. She even claimed several residents had experienced a drop in quality of life due to stress about unexpected propeller activity. To her credit, she managed to stir up just enough noise for Channel 9 to bite. They sent a junior field reporter named Amanda, whose entire on-camera vibe screamed, "I'd rather be covering the county fair." Amanda showed up with a tiny crew and a clipboard, asked a few dry questions about the project, and then finally asked the one that made me smile. "Is it true the helipad is your response to HOA interference over a parking space?" I didn't deny it. I said, "This isn't just about parking. This is about a principle. When someone uses red tape to block your driveway, sometimes the only logical response is to fly over the nonsense." That soundbite made it into their teaser segment that night, alongside B-roll footage of Karen waving a clipboard and yelling near my mailbox. Amanda's report was surprisingly fair, ending with, "While some residents have concerns, city officials confirm that every element of the helipad has passed inspection and met all legal requirements. So yes, technically, he can fly." You'd think Karen would take the L. Instead, she doubled down. The very next day, she called an emergency HOA-wide meeting and insisted on a community petition to ban aircraft within the neighborhood perimeter. Of course, such a petition had no legal basis, but that didn't stop her from printing it on glossy paper and knocking on doors in person. Multiple neighbors texted me screenshot. One said she claimed I was transporting strangers by air into our family neighborhood. Another said she told them I was arming the skies. One older couple reportedly asked her if I was building a weapons platform. She even brought in a supposed aviation lawyer to one of the HOA meetings, a guy who clearly hadn't read a single ordinance and was visibly sweating under Karen's monologue about air rights. He finally admitted that, no, there was no law being broken, and that maybe the HOA should focus on internal harmony instead. Karen fired him mid-meeting. Meanwhile, I was prepping for the big day. The helicopter was scheduled to arrive via transport, and the FAA had already been notified. The local reporter from Channel 5, the one I'd originally invited, had been quietly following the story and was ready to go live. He even brought a drone for overhead shot. That's when things really got theatrical. Karen tried to physically block the drone crew from setting up. She parked her minivan diagonally across the street, flung open the hatchback, and started unloading emergency signage about unauthorized media coverage. When the news crew asked her to move, she screamed that they were part of a psyop. Then she called the police. 2 officers showed up. I greeted them calmly and showed them my permits, the FAA clearance, and the neighborhood-wide notice I'd distributed. They checked everything, nodded politely, and walked over to Karen. I couldn't hear everything she said, but I did catch the words public endangerment, hostile aircraft, and aeronautical bullying. The officers looked somewhere between exhausted and amused. Eventually, they asked her to step away from the street and reminded her that, yes, freedom of the press still existed. The police weren't the only surprise visitors that day. About an hour before the scheduled landing, a small city car pulled up and out stepped none other than the mayor. Not a handler, not a press rep, the actual mayor. She introduced herself like we were old friends and said, "I just had to see this in person. We've been laughing about it at City Hall for a week." She walked the perimeter of the pad, complimented the workmanship, and then asked if I'd be willing to let her do a short interview for the city's own media bulletin. I agreed. She asked one question: "What would you say to those who think this is extreme?" I looked her dead in the eye and said, "Extreme is when your car gets towed from your own driveway by people who think the rules don't apply to them. I just found a higher route." The mayor gave a subtle smirk, nodded, and said, "Well played." Then, right on schedule, the helicopter arrived. The transporter pulled up and offloaded the craft with all the quiet elegance of a professional ballet. It was beautiful, sleek, polished, humming silently as the batteries charged. The pilot did one last systems check while the drone crew got into position. Karen, meanwhile, stood on her lawn with binoculars, muttering furiously into her phone. I didn't need to hear her to know she was calling every agency she could think of. But it didn't matter. Everything was legal, timed, permitted, and ready. And just before the blades spun to life, the reporter turned to me and said, "You know, this might be the most poetic escalation I've ever seen." I just smiled. "Sometimes," I replied, "you have to rise above the nonsense." Literally. As the camera rolled and the neighborhood gathered in stunned silence, I climbed into the passenger seat of the helicopter. The sun was just beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the polished concrete of my helipad. The blades spun faster, the air buzzed, and Karen covered her ears dramatically like we were launching a space shuttle. And then we lifted. Smooth, effortless, quiet. Above the HOA. Above the pettiness. Above everything. The moment the helicopter lifted off the pad, the neighborhood transformed into a live theater production, starring a stunned audience and one furious antagonist. As we ascended smoothly into the air, I looked out over the neat rows of beige rooftops and carefully trimmed lawns, and there in the middle of the cul-de-sac stood Karen, arms outstretched like she was trying to flag down an airplane on a deserted island. Her mouth moved furiously, but the sound of the rotor blades drowned out everything. From above, her frantic movements looked like a pantomime act gone off script, and for the first time in weeks, I felt true peace. The pilot, a calm guy named Joel who'd seen more than his share of absurd landings, glanced over and smirked. "That her down there?" he asked. I nodded. "Thought so," he said. She waved at us with all the warmth of someone throwing a chair. I laughed, watching her tiny form shrink beneath us. The ascent wasn't even the best part. The best part was knowing the entire event was being recorded from 4 angles, including a drone, 2 news cameras, and 1 smartphone held by the mayor herself, who had decided to document the occasion with surprising enthusiasm. Down below, a growing crowd of neighbors had gathered, some out of curiosity, some out of silent solidarity, and a few purely for entertainment. Lawn chairs had appeared on driveways. Someone brought popcorn. A couple of teenagers held up homemade signs that read, "Fly free," and "Don't mess with the sky guy." Even a group of kids had chalked up the sidewalk with helicopter doodles. The mood was electric. For once, the entire neighborhood was united, not by an HOA policy or seasonal garage sale, but by a singular, ridiculous, beautiful event. And at the center of it was a man who just wanted to park his car in peace. We hovered for a few minutes, Joel giving me a brief tour of the nearby skyline, then circled back for the landing. As we descended, I could see Karen on her phone again, pacing furiously. The Channel 5 reporter had a grin plastered across his face, like he was covering the suburban Super Bowl. He looked like he couldn't believe his luck. One minute he was doing boring town council segments, the next he was capturing the first residential helicopter landing ever executed out of spite. When we touched down, the crowd actually applauded. I stepped out like a man arriving at his own movie premiere. It was absurd, yes, but it was mine. As I walked over to greet the news crew, the reporter extended his mic and asked the question I knew was coming. "How does it feel to have taken the high road, literally?" I paused, glanced toward Karen, who was glaring so hard I thought her visor might catch fire, and said, "Honestly, I just needed a place to land where nobody would tow my vehicle." The crowd laughed. The segment would air that night with the title, "From Towed to Airborne, One Man's Flight Over HOA Tyranny." Karen wasn't laughing. Not even close. That afternoon, she submitted a formal noise complaint to the city. The problem? The helicopter hadn't exceeded any decibel limit. It was electric, quiet, sleek. The FAA had already tested the site for sound compliance. Her complaint was returned with a polite but firm, "No violation found." She tried again with a health and safety complaint. Rejected. Then she attempted to push a new community rule through the HOA banning any and all airborne vehicles or devices within 300 feet of residential dwellings. That failed too, mostly because it was worded so poorly it would have banned hot air balloons, drones, and even large kites. But what she didn't expect was the backlash. The residents had had enough. 4 years she'd ruled over the HOA with passive-aggressive newsletters and endless nitpicking. But this was too much. People who'd never spoken up before began raising questions at the next meeting. Why were HOA funds being used to hire lawyers for personal vendettas? Why was the board obsessed with one man's driveway when the community center hadn't been painted in 3 years? Why had nobody seen the financial report for the annual dues? The turning point came when someone brought up the security footage I'd submitted weeks earlier. The one showing her vice president trying to deface my helipad in the dead of night. It had made the rounds quietly, and now it was public knowledge. Karen tried to shift blame, claim ignorance, even said it was just a misunderstanding, but the damage was done. The board crumbled from within. 2 members resigned. A petition to recall the president was circulated the next day and gathered more than enough signatures in under 48 hours. Karen, in full damage control mode, tried one final tactic. She held a community restoration rally in her front yard, complete with banners about neighborhood unity and catered lemonade. Only 3 people showed up, and one of them was the delivery guy who brought the lemonade. Meanwhile, across the street, I hosted a spontaneous helipad happy hour on my lawn. I set up a few folding tables, passed out sodas, and played chill music through my outdoor speakers. A dozen neighbors came by. People brought chips, cookies, lawn chairs. One woman brought cupcakes shaped like helicopters. Someone else brought a Bluetooth speaker and played Danger Zone on loop for half an hour. At one point during the gathering, the mayor returned, no cameras this time, just her and her husband stopping by on a walk. She raised a can of soda in my direction and said, You might have done more for this community with a helicopter than our HOA has in 10 years. I replied, well, I don't do things halfway. We both laughed, and the moment felt oddly profound for something sparked by parking dispute. That night, the Channel 5 segment aired to a broader audience. It was shared online, clipped for social media, and turned into a trending post under the tag #DrivewayPilot. Someone even edited a dramatic trailer version of the story, complete with orchestral music and slow-motion shots of the takeoff. Within 24 hours, I had interview requests from 2 radio stations, a local podcast, and a YouTube channel that specialized in stories of tactical petty revenge. I declined most of them, but I agreed to one small podcast run by a high school student down the street, just because I appreciated the hustle. But while I was enjoying the surge of neighborhood goodwill and online fame, Karen's world was shrinking. At the next HOA meeting, one I didn't attend but got full details about, she tried to declare the helicopter a foreign transportation threat. A lawyer in the room reminded her that the helicopter was domestic, registered, and entirely private. She tried to argue the emotional impact of rotor blade. Someone countered by reading a letter from a neighbor who said the helipad inspired his kids to study engineering. The vote to remove her passed with an overwhelming majority. Within a week, a moving truck appeared outside her house. No official farewell. No goodbye flyers. Just a quiet, bitter retreat. And just like that, the HOA tyrant was gone, the neighborhood was at peace, and my helipad stood as a monument, not to escalation, but to creative resistance. I didn't build it for spite. I built it to prove a point. That if you know the rules better than the people abusing them, you can take any battle and turn it into your runway. After Karen's swift departure, the air in the neighborhood changed in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just quieter. Though the absence of passive-aggressive clipboard patrols certainly helped, it was lighter. People smiled more. The usual cautious nods between neighbors became full conversations. Someone even mowed their lawn while playing music, which had apparently been a silent rebellion against her years-long ban on audible disturbances before 4 p.m. The HOA, now run by a temporary committee until a formal election, shifted focus from enforcing rules no one remembered agreeing to and started addressing actual community need. The community board posted updates about sidewalk repairs and new dog waste stations instead of lawn height infractions and flowerbed uniformity. I could have stepped back after that. I had made my point, lifted off, literally, and watched the tyrant fall. But something about the absurd journey from driveway disputes to helicopter landings made me reflect on just how close I'd come to letting someone else dictate the limits of my life. I didn't build a helipad just to fight Karen. I built it because I could, because the system had rules and she had only ever enforced the ones that served her. I wanted to be a reminder that knowing the rules better than the bully could be its own kind of power. With things calm again, I repurposed the helipad area into something a little more welcoming. It still functioned as a legal landing zone, but I added soft lights around it, installed a few benches along the edges, and had a custom-designed metal sign made that simply read, "The Hangar." My backyard transformed into a casual community gathering space. On weekends, neighbors would bring snacks and hang out, sometimes playing music or bringing folding chairs. A retired Navy vet named Hank brought a miniature flight simulator setup one Saturday and taught kids the basics of takeoffs and landings. Parents watched while sipping iced tea, and kids who had only known Karen's version of the HOA now saw something totally different. Possibility, creativity, fun. I never officially joined the HOA board, though I was offered a seat. I politely declined. I told them my role was more of a reminder than a rulemaker. Instead, I nominated a longtime resident, Miriam, a quiet but sharp former librarian who had lived there for over 20 years and once memorized the entire HOA charter just to win a bet. She ran unopposed and was elected in a landslide. Within a month, she rewrote half the outdated bylaws and added a new clause requiring all board decisions to be made publicly with recorded vote. Transparency became policy. Nobody missed the secrecy. Of course, the internet hadn't forgotten about me. My story made rounds on social media, trending for a while under tags like #HelipadRevenge and #SkyJustice. Memes followed. Someone photoshopped my face onto a Top Gun poster. A YouTuber animated a stick figure reenactment that racked up over 2 million views in a week. A surprising number of messages arrived from strangers, some just laughing at the story, others sharing their own battles with overreaching HOAs. One guy in Texas asked if I'd help him design a landing strip for his ultralight aircraft. I declined, but I did send him a copy of my original zoning form with a smiley face drawn in the corner. Then came a surprise I never saw coming. One morning, a letter arrived, an actual, handwritten thank you note. It was from a woman who had recently moved into a neighborhood with an infamously strict HOA and felt like she was suffocating under their rules. She wrote, "Your story gave me hope. Not just because of the helicopter, but because you didn't roll over. You reminded me that sometimes, fighting back with precision is better than fighting back with noise." She signed it simply, a fellow grounded pilot. A few weeks later, Channel 5 returned for a follow-up segment. They brought the same reporter, who now greeted me like an old friend and said, "Honestly, we needed something like this. Most stories these days are all gloom. Yours?" Yours had lift. This time, they interviewed several neighbors, not just about the helipad, but about the shift in the community. One woman talked about how she used to dread HOA meetings and now looked forward to them. Another said her kids had taken an interest in aviation because of the guy with the driveway copter. And then there was Hank, who gave the camera a wink and said, "That guy didn't just land a helicopter. He landed the neighborhood back on its feet." The segment ended with a sweeping drone shot of the hangar at sunset. People gathered around, soft music playing in the background. When it aired, the station's website crashed from too much traffic. Comments flooded in, calling the whole thing the most satisfying HOA revenge arc ever told. A local artist even painted a mural based on the story, featuring a cartoon helicopter taking off from a pad shaped like a "no parking" sign. It was both ridiculous and oddly moving. In the midst of all that attention, I made one final move that no one expected. I donated a small fund to a local youth STEM program under the condition they add a short module on zoning laws and local government processes. The director laughed and asked, "Why zoning?" I told him, "Because if kids learn how to read the rules early, they'll be unstoppable." He smiled and agreed. The module now exists under the name Sky's the Limit: Urban Flight and Local Policy. Every time I think about it, I imagine Karen's expression if she ever stumbled across it. That alone is worth it. As time passed, things settled into a new normal. The helipad didn't get much use, honestly, but it didn't need to. It existed as a symbol, a reminder, a standing monument to what one person could do when pushed too far. The neighborhood thrived, the HOA mellowed, and the hangar became a regular weekend hangout. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit out there alone, the lights casting a soft glow on the concrete, and think about how the whole thing started with a blocked driveway and a bad attitude. One evening, a neighbor brought over a gift: a small, gold-plated model helicopter on a black base. The plaque read, "To the man who legally flew over HOA nonsense." We laughed, toasted with lemonade, and put it on a little shelf I'd built near the helipad. And just like that, the story came full circle. Not with chaos, not with vengeance, but with community, calm skies, and the quiet satisfaction of a well-landed point.